for A Strong Nebraska. We are looking forward to having another great webinar today. Please use the audio number on your screen to dial in to the webinar. And if you would dial in from a landline, that's preferable for audio options. If not, please mute your phone using *6. And if you'd like to unmute your phone, press #6. We would also like to mention that at the very top of your screen, there is a little person that looks like she's raising her hand. You can just click on that. That's a drop down, and it will give you an option to raise your hand. We can unmute your line so you can ask a verbal question. If you'd like to type a written question, there's a Q&A box in the lower right-hand corner of your screen. So now we'd like to introduce Abbie Kretz. She is with the Heartland Workers Center. She's lead organizer, and she is going to be leading us through the webinar today on community assessments and providing a case study of what the results that they did at the Heartland Workers Center. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that you can see Abbie. All right, Abbie, go ahead.
Hi, everyone. How are you? Oh, yeah, you can't respond. I forgot. So, yes, I'm Abbie Kretz. I'm the lead organizer with the Heartland Workers Center, and I've been with the organization for, I think, about 8 years now. And so just to kind of give you a background, so I'll go ahead and move some of the slides. So Joe asked us to do a presentation on community assessments because we did one back in 2015. So perhaps for those of you who aren't familiar with a community assessment is a survey that's undertaken by an established neighborhood organization to better understand the way residents in a given neighborhood live in their lives, where they work, whether they have health insurance or not, you know, what they do for employment, maybe where their kids go to school. And it's often a way that we can ensure that the work that we do is better targeted to the community that we're working with. I don't claim to be an expert on community assessments. I am very much into data. I have a master's degree in sociology, and so I really appreciate good data. And so that's something about me in terms of this. As an organization, we actually decided to do a community assessment in 2015. Prior to that, since 2012, we had done Get Out the Vote campaigns for 3 previous election cycles. And the purpose of doing that was to increase Latino voter participation in South Omaha. So we really went out and did a lot of voter education, talked about people, shared information with folks about who the candidates were, all of them. So as a nonprofit, many of you guys know we can't endorse candidates or political parties, but just getting out the information out there about who's running for office, how the election cycle works here, and then also partnering with the Election Commission to make sure that there are bilingual poll workers as well. But what we realized through this process too is that civic engagement goes beyond just election cycles. And how could we, by understanding better what some of the community issues are, connect folks to connect those issues with actual voting. So, and I think for us, the purpose of doing it was a way, one, we did it in 2015 because it was a non-election year. And so that really provided us with the opportunity to do this. We had the time and the energy. We used it as a way to gather data, so through the actual findings of the assessment, to understand the issues at a household, individual household level, as well as within neighborhoods, and even more so begin to identify by leaders. And for us, that last piece was really principal because it brought in, it allowed a lot of new organizers we had at the time to begin to practice community organizing, which again is talking to folks, understanding their issues, who are these potential leaders, but how do they also relate to others in the neighborhood? Because a lot of the things that we're hearing in one street, let's say M Street, that same issue was being heard on N or O streets as well. And so they're really showing that connection through that. So in order to start, so like I said at the beginning, we're just going to kind of share some of what we had done, and maybe what our experience did was to help some of you guys. So obviously we had to apply for a grant to do this work, and we related it back to our civic engagement program as a continuation. And as I stated earlier, this wasn't just something new, but something that supported the work that we had been doing over time. Secondly, we also hired a consultant. So we hired a guy that we had met a few years before who had experience doing community work, community development work, and doing community assessments. And for us, that was really important to also hire a consultant because, one, he had the experience in terms of analyzing data, both census data and the data that we would be collecting, providing experience, expertise, or knowledge on how the process works, how to properly formulate some questions. And then actually, I think the key part there too is that by hiring somebody, he had the time to do it in the end. I think sometimes we could do this and then move on, but not really getting the final steps done to take the time to look at it and analyze it and then provide a report. So that's what we did. In terms of actually preparing the assessment, so we understood South Omaha. Like I said earlier, we did get out the vote campaigns, and we focused on about 8 precincts in the South Omaha area that had a large Latino population. And we knew that through the census, but we also wanted to delve in a little bit further to better understand what the census said about South Omaha, including the poverty levels, what the foreign-born populations or the citizen and non-citizens look like, housing, income, employment, education levels, and then means of transportation. And so all of that we were able to look at by census tracts. So those are different neighborhoods that the census looks at and understand some of those things. So then with that, we were kind of given a better overview of what the South Omaha community looks like, and then from there formulate some questions. Sorry, just one thing. Does everybody have their phone on mute? I hear a little background noise. If you could just double check that as we continue, that'd be great. And then next, the next thing, so after we looked at the census data, we looked at these different census tracts that you guys can see on the screen. And we were able to see what the total population was, the total foreign-born, those born in Latin America, those who speak Spanish at home, and then just kind of different areas. And so based on this information, we were able to formulate questions. So we began to actually prepare for the assessment. We did use some of the census data, but also from our own experience, kind of some things that we wanted to look at too. So you can see the housing, employment, income, healthcare, education. Some of those were definitely related to the census data, but we also wanted to understand people's quality of life and public services. So what they thought about their neighborhood, how they engaged with their neighbors, how responsive they thought the police and firefighters were to any community needs. And then for us, having done the Get Out the Vote campaigns, we connected the political participation back to folks. So were they involved in any other community organizations? Were they involved in their churches? Did they vote in the previous elections? Did they know how to communicate with their elected officials? And so we use the census to understand some things, but we also kind of use the assessment to understand how some of the work that we've been doing, how people can relate to that as well, or how they are related to the work through their own lives. So with that, we began to prepare the assessment. So after we met with some stakeholders throughout the community, kind of understand some of their issues, crafted the final assessment tool, and it was kind of long. It was about 134 questions, but that might have included some questions that said if this person said no, move to this question. If they said yes, move to the other questions. And again, we had them organized by different areas as well, as you saw before. And then we determined the survey area. So we looked at 8 South Omaha precincts, and that's, again, where we had done Get Out the Vote campaigns previously, and where there was a large Latino population as well, and then also where there were high levels of poverty. So that was that. And then from there, so that's what we all did in basically from December November, December of 2014 up until May. And so in May, we began to train the staff on how to use the assessment tool. So one key thing, and also as I learned through some of my coursework in sociology as well, was that you want to make sure that your staff or those who are doing the assessment know how to properly use it. Because you want to make sure that the data that you're collecting is valid and in a sense can't be judged later and said that it wasn't collected properly. So as long as they have a good understanding of how it works, then you can send them off to do it. We actually identified Latino households using the Voter Activation Network, or the VAN file. And at the time, because Nebraska wasn't, Latino specifically weren't targeted, we were able to target folks from a large demographic area, folks who were both registered voters or likely citizens, and then some who are not. I think since then we've been able to clean up the data a bit, but that kind of gave us a large perspective of who's all living in the area. And then from there, we had staff and leaders and volunteers go door to door during 3 shifts. So they went to talk to folks from 10 to noon, 3 to 5, and 6 to 8. I will say since then we've definitely learned that 6 to 8 or 5 to 8 is probably a better time to meet people, especially in their home when they're, not, when they're, especially after work. But I think the 10, you're going to find different groups of folks throughout the day who will all have different perspectives, and so that's also why we focused on those 3 time zones. Or not time zones, that would be crazy. 3 different time periods. And then when we actually did the assessment, so we did go door to door, but at the same time we also partnered with 5 churches and organizations working with the Spanish-speaking community in South Omaha, so using those target populations to also collect data was important. And that might have been because sometimes those people may not have been home at other times, and I think that also helped us to reach people who maybe weren't citizens or likely citizens, and to also open up some of our target population as well. And then during this time when we were conducting it, it was also a way to reconnect with some of the folks that we maybe spoke with during the previous 3 election cycles. So people began to really recognize who we were as an organization, and that having been at their houses before helped us get our foot in the door to speak with them. And then and just to kind of clarify, because it was about 134 questions, it would take anywhere between 20 to 40 minutes to conduct each survey. And it wasn't just about collecting data, as I stated to you before. It was also about really identifying leaders. So what are some of the stories behind some of that data, and how do people see themselves getting engaged later on? And so we did finish the assessment by October of 2015. We had actually visited 2, as you can see there, over 2,300 houses. And we collected 630 total surveys. So that's a pretty good number of surveys collected. And then we identified 246 potential leaders. So people who, as we talked to them, how do they see themselves, how do they connect with these stories, but how do they see themselves connecting with some of their neighbors to actually begin to work on the issues that we found in the survey? Because it wasn't just for us to collect the data, but to engage those community members to actually make changes in their areas. And I think for us that's why that key piece to community organizing was so important. I'm going to go through some of the major findings that we found. So as you saw earlier, we talked about 6 different areas. We found that many people, about almost half, had to sacrifice other expenses to pay for utilities and food. We also found specifically to that people who worked in the food processing, construction, and hotel industries were more likely to say that they had to sacrifice their expenses than others. And then the interesting thing too, we found that a lot of 65%, over 2/3 of the respondents, said that they lived in their homes for over 5 years, and that 71% actually own their homes. So this showed us that people were long-term residents, really actually invested in their communities, and so with that also showed us that these are people who want to stay here, and because they live there and have lived there for over 5 years, we can continue to work with them to make change. Another thing, we found that many had serious concerns about street conditions and crime in their community. About over a quarter of them said that people were working or people in the household could be working but were not. So this left questions as to why. What do unemployment rates look like here as well? 35% didn't have health insurance. There were various factors for that as well, either people's status, the expense of health care at the time, and it's still very expensive, or didn't qualify for Medicaid because of the cliff effect. And then we also found that 80% stated they were pleased with the education that their children received. And so I think, and a lot of them too, and I don't have the number up there, actually sent their kids to the neighborhood schools. The majority actually sent their kids to OPS schools and said they were pleased with the education as well. And so I think kind of challenges some of the rhetoric we hear about Omaha public schools as well, and the education that kids in public schools are receiving. And then in terms of our political participation area, we found that only a quarter of the respondents actually knew how to reach out to their elected officials. So for us, that said that not many people actually know like how to reach out when they have concerns about even just street conditions. It could be just city officials, or when we talk about immigration, like how to reach out to federal representatives as well. People weren't unsure of how to actually be engaged. But on the plus side, we found that over 3/4 said that they actually were interested in working with others in the community to make change. So although we're finding some of the data that's perhaps not quite exciting or kind of depressing, we did see a piece of hope because people, they cared about these issues and wanted to make change and work with others in doing so. So after the assessment, we shared the findings at our first political convention in November of 2015. And it was just kind of an overview of like, this is what we found. From there, in January of 2016, we began to host community meetings to share the findings with some of the actual leaders that we had identified, and then began to kind of break them down and discuss them even further. So what did people think was important? How did they relate to what we were finding? And from there, we developed a community platform based on the issues. And then you're going to see here that on the left, or that's the right, you're going to see a kind of the platform that we had developed. When we initially kind of debated this with people as well, it kind of seemed like it was in a hierarchical sense, like one was more important. But that didn't seem to work out, and that's because not everybody perhaps thought health insurance was the most important thing for them. Maybe immigration wasn't the most important thing, but in a way that this circular representation shows that everything is related and everything is important. It's just kind of a matter of showing that connection, so that's why we did that. And we developed a community platform because it was a way to, in a sense, prioritize some of the issues and do it in a way that people could relate to, and begin to show that this is what we want to work on in the next 2 years. And so we've been using that community platform now with these issues, with the findings, to continue to organize our core teams, or our teams of leaders in now 10 South Omaha precincts, or 10 South Omaha neighborhoods. And what we've found as well, even 2 years later, that some of these issues still remain. And so really showing that we have to continue to push for these things. We still have to continue to focus on community organizing to make change on these issues. And so with that, as we organize, continuing to prepare for our second biennial political convention next month. I think just some recommendations based on our experiences: really make sure that you have somebody who can dedicate specifically to the project, whether it be a full-time staff member or consultant. And you want to make sure that that person understands, how to analyze data, has the tools that they need, knows how to prepare surveys, and can ensure the validity, so how to conduct good surveys. And I think the other thing too is also ensure that those who participate have a chance to see and understand the findings, and how can they play a role in changing some of those findings. I'm originally from Schuyler, so being having a large Latino population, a lot of people would go to Schuyler and interview people or do surveys or collect data, but those findings a lot of times never came back to the community. And so I think as we do these assessments, making sure that people who are part of it understand the process and can be a part of making a change, rather than just, so it's that more collective model than a top-down model. And then if you'd like to see our assessment, we actually finally put it together in a beautiful format this May. So it took a while for us to finally get it assessed and brought together in a format that was printable and presentable. And then in the end, we also partnered with one of our board members who happens to teach at UNO, and he dissected some of the data a little bit further to look at further relationships, and so that's also available on the assessment. And I think if you have any questions or comments, either now or later, you're welcome to go ahead and place those into the thing or shoot me an email.
Thank you, Abbie, so much for such a great presentation. Does anyone have any follow-up questions? Either type them in the chat box in the bottom right, or you can raise your hand. We can start your microphone so you can ask a question verbally. One thought I had, Abbie, is I'm wondering how, oh wait, we do have a question from Selena Martinez. She's asking, did you engage neighbors to knock on doors with you?
I believe we had some folks who also participated, so since we did the Get Out the Vote campaigns, they were also involved in going door to door as a follow-up from some of our canvassers. Does that answer the question?
Yes, thank you. Another thought is, how do you continue to follow up with those people that you engaged with, those 10 core groups that you have in South Omaha? What do you do to continue that relationship?
So the initial assessment kind of, in a way, gave us, like I said, our foot in the door. And so as organizers, we go out and conduct individual meetings afterwards, so to understand who the people are that were there, how, I mean, that's a tool that we use. So, but I think by understanding who people are first, you can continue to engage with them. And how does my story connect with their story? And how can we bring them then together in these community meetings to continue to follow up on these issues? So that's what we're doing. That's what we've been doing over the last year especially. So we've continued to visit people for Get Out the Vote campaigns, and then more recently going back and following up with some of these neighbors to see how they still connect with these issues. Have things changed? Have they not? And you know what? Honestly, sometimes the people that we identified initially, their interests have changed since then, and so they're no longer interested. Perhaps they've moved, but I think that the overarching goal is to continue to find people to be engaged and work on these things.
Wonderful, thank you. Other questions? Okay, here's another question from Selena. As you identified leaders, how did you flag or track them to follow up with them?
So I think I forgot a part. So when we actually collected the data, we did it by paper. And then we brought back that information and then typed it into SurveyMonkey, I believe. I didn't say that. So, I mean, now because of, I think what we do is, make sure we budgeted for it so we could have iPads and stuff like that. So on the actual, like I stated before, we had VAN, and so on the survey that we connected through VAN, we asked, is this person a potential leader? So we were able just to mark that question, and then in the end we were able to pull up that list of people that we had marked as potential leaders and then followed up with them through that.
A lot of time-intensive data collection and data entry.
Yeah. Well, and I think, so I know it's kind of old school, and maybe things would change now, but I think the paper, in a sense, is not as intimidating as the iPad may have been, and this was only 2 years ago. But I think that's also why we opted for that, to be able to have more of a conversation and to engage with people that way, rather than, finding that maybe I'm old school, I guess, but that seemed more conversational rather than just the technology that we have now. But it is very time intensive. Like you saw, it took about 5 months to do it, or actually about 10, actually it took the whole year in terms of planning, doing a lot of the pre-work, actually training staff, conducting it. We always also did debriefs with the staff at the end of the day to kind of figure out, was the tool working? Are we finding people at those times of the day? Are people responding? How long are these surveys taking? What are some of the commonalities that we're finding? What are some of the stories behind that? So always making sure that this wasn't just going out and coming back, but that there was that evaluative piece as well.
Thank you. And that does answer Selena's questions. Does anyone else have a question or a comment for Abbie? Are you all just soaking in all of the great information? Probably.
I only had 20 minutes to talk, so I know I talked fast.
That's okay. Okay. Well, Abbie's name and email address is listed there on your screen. Again, we will provide the slides to everyone that's dialed in on our call today. We'll also put up a recording of this webinar on the Coalition's YouTube page so you can go back and watch it again and refresh your memory and share it with others. I will like to put up, yes, Abbie, you have another thought?
No, go ahead and finish. I just wanted to close out. I think, like for us, we did a community assessment versus a needs assessment to kind of really understand like what were some of the positive pieces and perhaps the challenges of the community we're assessing. Because I think as you saw on especially at the end, that there were so many people willing to work with others. So we were able to see like what the good things were and maybe some of the challenges. And so that's why we did a community assessment overall. And I think, we tailored it to work for what we were doing. And so I think each organization has to take time to kind of figure out why would they ask some of these questions. But I think doing this was helpful too because it gave us perspective. One, it really began to focus on some of the principles of organizing first. But two, really to go back and take that intentional time to listen to the people that we're working with rather than making assumptions about the communities that we're working with. And so I think that's why it was really important for us to do this too.
Do you find that you can leverage that data in other conversations, either with policy leaders or other community leaders to talk about, this is what we found in this assessment. These are some concerns that are still concerns, and you kind of have that data to back up your thoughts.
Yeah, I know that we used it like during the legislative session, showing, especially with healthcare, that there's still a large part of the population that doesn't have access to quality healthcare. And that's, again, because they can't afford it or have access to it through their employer or because they don't have, the proper immigration papers. So there's a lot of speculation, not speculation, but there's a lot of potential for policy with the data that's collected. And then you actually have the piece to show. So we're not just making these comments up. We're not just making things up as we go along, but we actually talk to people and we talk to the community members, we talk to your constituents, and this is what they said. And so how can we work together to improve it? And again, we don't want to do it in a way that's attacking, but really a way that says that this is really going on and we're not just making it up. And so I think,
have you had any thoughts of expanding it? What was that?
Oh, I don't know what I said. I forgot.
Okay. I was curious if you had any thoughts of expanding and doing a community assessment in other parts of Nebraska.
We had initially thought about doing it in Schuyler a couple years ago, but when we approached the community with it, it wasn't the right time. And I think for us, like having been established, especially with the Get Out the Vote campaigns, was really important first, because it wasn't like we were just coming into survey as researchers, but really had established ourselves as working in the community and wanted to continue to do that through this assessment. And so I think, yes, we would like to. It's a matter of making sure that we have folks in those communities who would actually want to be a part of it.
Great, thank you. Any other thoughts or questions for Abbie? Okay, I'm going to show just our ending slide here so you can see what's coming up next. Next Tuesday, we will have our how to, I don't know what happened there, sorry. Oh, okay. How to use the Nebraska legislative website. And then every Tuesday from 11:30 to 12 through December 5th, we will continue to have our webinars. So next week is, again, how to use the website, nebraskalegislature.com. Really nice, easy to use, but it takes a little practice. So we'll walk through that next week, and then we'll talk about how a bill becomes a law, and then we'll talk about federal and state lobbying rules, so federal and Nebraska state lobbying rules. So we hope that you will continue to join us every Tuesday from 11:30 to noon. And again, you can find these resources on our YouTube page, and then we'll also send the link out through our e-news every week. So you'll have all of the resources to go back and review and ask questions of our presenters. So thank you so much for joining us on this Tuesday, and we hope you have a wonderful afternoon.